cataclysmically better than anything we have now, which is damaging ourselves and our environment, and is on pace to be getting worse exponentially. This brings us to part 3, objections and projections. Now, I'm moving very quickly here. The preceding resource-based economic model treatment is a very compressed primer. Joe did a wonderful job of a more extensive treatment of this, which is similar to other lectures that have been given, and of course our orientation guide. So I want everyone to, I'm really happy that a thorough explanation was given, because this, if you weren't familiar with this would be very, very truncated, which is very much is. And I really encourage everyone to follow up with questions with all the resources that we have at thezeitgeistmovement.com. One thing I do recommend as a counterpart to the human necessity angle, the build-up inferential logical approach that I just denoted, is a section called Project Earth I did in a lecture called Where Are We Going? Well, there's also, of course, a truncated version of that in the films like this moving forward. So please know that there's much more to it than this, but I hope the reasoning of what I've just described is coming through. My goal here in that description was to approach it from the angle of human need, which is something, unfortunately, we don't think about. Not just the human need aspect, but also the systems Earth approach and the relationship between the two and what we have to do to find balance. Maximum efficiency and balance to enable as much prosperity as possible. That's the equation, that's the calculation. Now, my goal with part 3 is to not only address some very common criticisms and speculations that come up regarding what we just described and all the other materials that we have, but also to use those points to further communicate some other important issues of the resource-based economy. But before I begin, I think it's important to discuss something that's very important to me that I see rising in the community, on the internet, and my own personal experiences and interactions with people, and that is the issue of violence in communication. Needless to say, we're all victims of culture on one level or another. That means we've been influenced and groomed into certain patterns of thought by our environment. And one of the cultural staples of modern society, unfortunately, is the use of verbal violence to support one's position. And sadly, I don't know anyone who doesn't impulsively engage in this from time to time, including myself. Calling people names, might not seem as offensive as physical assault, but the intent is essentially the same. The intent is to injure, to dehumanize and humiliate. Verbal violence is just a different degree of physical violence. In fact, I'm a firm believer, and I've done a tremendous amount of study on the work of Martin Luther King and Gandhi, and all of the initiators of the nonviolent communication movement. The goal of nonviolent communication is to try and leave the door open for others to enter, if they choose to do so, to unconditionally invite them to accept you regardless of how much they actually hate you and wish to injure you on whatever level. Easier said than done, but it really is the only effective method. I state this because the nature of our work in the Zeitgeist movement has become a magnet and will continue to become a magnet for various levels of assault. Think about it. All of us that are identified with this, we're here telling the world that what they're doing is wrong at the basic level of operational understanding. We're here initiating global change that exceeds anything attempted in human history, as far as I know. A radical shift away from everything the majority of people on this planet have come to identify with. So hostility is not only expected, it's inevitable. And it's very important that we all be prepared for this intellectually and emotionally, and have great patience and understanding and know how to behave accurately, if you will. Now, we always have a lot of seriousness in the discussions that naturally seriousness is important, it's where we are, but I tried to make this a little bit more relaxed in my presentation of the critics of the resource-based economy. First of all, about 99% of the time, the critics of this system approach it from the standpoint of prior surface associations from history. In fact, the greatest phrase I've ever heard as of yet was someone who referred to it as Marxism with robots. Now, I'm not blind. That's a Tiny the Communist robot. He's a good guy. Now, I'm not blind. I see the obvious surface associations with historically proposed communism. But the fact is, as I alluded to in truncated fashion, the train of thought that arrives at a resource-based economy is self-evident. Those that use this rhetoric often present it as though we are building upon those early ideas. Well, no. Communism, in whatever form, might not have ever existed, and it wouldn't change anything as to the inferential logic that arrives at a resource-based economy. Natural law is natural law. Human needs, and a finite planet is a finite planet. So the entire argument is worthless and does nothing but waste time, and I recommend the avoidance of that debate unless you want to bring up what I just described. If you pay close attention, by the way, the same people that tend to impose their communist, socialist, Marxist label upon us are also the ones that rarely ever address the core foundational reasoning of the model that we're talking about. They never talk about it. They also never talk about the failing social structure. They ignore all of it and just look at the surface appearance, the cover of the book that they recognize, the projection that they manifest because of their conditioning. Next, we have a unique one that has become much more prominent, and I hear it more than I care to admit, and that is the feared re-education. Since we speak about the need for people to shift their values into something that is more in line with natural law and show the reasoning for it, of course, suddenly we're just like the early totalitarian communists who seek to put people in forced re-education camps so they can be brainwashed into following the social system. Well, actually, anytime any known idea is overturned by new information, such as when Galileo informed the Catholic Church that the Earth was in fact not the center of the universe or solar system, re-education had commenced. In fact, the entire whole of the evolution of knowledge is the constant process of, yes, re-education, updating current beliefs. I mean, this is self-evident, but I'd like to make this very, 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 very clear, because I'm frankly tired of hearing it. Again, this is an associative attack ultimately in the end, just like the communist one. It's people that are really trying to pull an emotional reaction out of others to stop their critical thought, to really investigate what we're talking about. So communism, they support re-education. This is a growing phenomenon, both in sort of subculture and into pseudo-mainstream attacks that I've seen on myself, the Venus Project, and the movement. Then we have the moody outburst. What if I don't want to live in your society? Well, then don't. Just as arrangements exist for subcultures today who reject modern life, in the future, equally as viable conditions can be met. If a group wants to break off and go play their little Monopoly game somewhere, go ahead. I have a hard time believing, frankly, that once the system is set in motion and the fruits of its efficiency are seen by everyone, not to mention the true freedom people will have, which would be unlike anything the world has ever seen once the life-wasting, redundant labor for income system is removed, that people will still reject. I believe they will easily see the light. And then there is the carryover anti-socialist propaganda echoes, where anything that regards an equitable distribution of resources or wealth, anything, is evidently just an assault on all the honest capitalists, stealing their hard-earned wealth and property. The transition to a resource-based economy is not by force, okay? Totalitarianism and government force don't work. It's not even a moral issue at the end of the day. It doesn't work. It simply creates anger, resentment, and produces underground subcultures. The only way the Earth's resources can become common heritage of all the world's people, which is what we need to do, is when people see the reasoning and merit for themselves, which is, of course, why we're all here and what our task really is on a basic level at this stage. And then we have our cherished democracy. What about democracy in a resource-based economy? Well, I say, what exactly are you expecting? Wading into some voting booth every couple of years like a mind slave, pushing a button for a candidate you have zero control over once elected? It really, when you step back, you can hear the irritation in my voice, because in my all sheer honest opinion, I can't believe that it's still around. I can't believe we're still doing it. The real election of relevance is not the election of people. That is a dated, bizarre notion that we think it's a give-in. It's a give-in to really a power system. We're enabling the power system of control. Giving, we're literally, as this cartoon depicts, the freedom to elect our dictators. Because we have no control over anything they do once they're elected. And then a couple of years go by, oh, maybe we can remove them. Real election of relevance is not the election of people, it's the election of ideas. It's creating an actual system of interaction where new ideas can be submitted by everyone, and they are technically evaluated for their relevance and possibility. Please see the orientation guide that we have at the zeitgeistmovement.com for the proposed central database program, an extrapolation of modern AI understandings. It sounds fanciful, it sounds like science fiction, but these realities are coming to fruition very, very quickly. And decision-making processes, the digestion of information, even through our crude language, is becoming viable through automated systems. And it would mediate our human interaction and evaluate proposals objectively, as opposed to a political party with lobbyist influences that might see our idea as viable in a scientific sense, but because of their influence, they will override it, which happens on a daily basis. I probably shouldn't have to even explain that. Okay, and then we have collectivism doesn't work. And this is a very common one. Collectivism just doesn't work. If the core basis of collectivism, and its foundational definition, what is it really? It's simply a group of people working together for their common good as a whole. If this wasn't working, we wouldn't have business, we wouldn't have military, we wouldn't have sports teams, we wouldn't have people working in any group effort whatsoever. As far as using the model of a collective as the basis of a social system, which is of course a very large extreme of such an idea, and by the way, which has never really been seriously tried. People throw out the collectivist notion as though historically, in the early communist states, that these were true collective societies. No, they were not. They were always dictatorships by design, autocratic, which is not collective. A real collective is simply society working together as a team, like a family, in fact. Imagine that. And the last one for this section, my favorite, it's against human nature. We are simply unable to work together on a large scale because of our evolutionarily embedded self-interest. No hope, we're stuck, everyone go home. To this day, I'm amazed at how many people I run into with no education on the matter whatsoever, not opening one book, that throw out the human nature argument as the immutable force that will never allow any type of community, anything really, to come to fruition. Especially, of course, for resource-based economy. Just recently, I read an article that was produced essentially by the John Birch Society, which is a right-wing anti-communist group. But the very last paragraph of this bashing of Zeitgeist and the Venus Project, we're like, well, Jacques Fresco, he can have his little fantasy, it's nice and cute, but unfortunately, human nature won't allow it. And I can assure you that the guy has never done anything to research what that actually means. It's the last bastion of those who have nothing else to say in defense to support their indoctrination. The ultimate question, to delve into this a little bit, is it against human nature to cooperate? That's the central question. It certainly seems like that if you take the narrow view of history on the surface level, and you look at the tremendous divisions and conflicts throughout time. We see endless series of wars, genocides, conquests, severe competitive tendencies, of course, power abuses. And given that's the power we recognize historically, given that we see this in our history books, there's no real background as to the foundation of